Yeah, so I got a Lego set actually recently, and it was pretty cool. I it's like the Great Pyramid. Michael
Oh
got it for
wow.
me, and it's like you can build it, and then you on the one side you can literally see inside of it, like all the little tunnels and stuff, like a cross section. It's pretty neat.
Does it have booby traps?
Yeah, kind of. Actually, yeah, kind of. It's pretty cool. Lego sets are pretty amazing these days. I don't know, they're insane.
Yeah, I know. I was randomly served by YouTube a video of somebody assembling a Lego set, a Technics Lego set,
Okay.
and I think it's because I watch so many ASMR videos and it's just sort of gentle clicking noises. So I think that's probably why I was served it, because there's an algorithmic connection there. But then I just got addicted to the idea of having another Lego set, so I bought the Batman Batmobile, and I've been building that for the last
Oh,
few days. And I've discovered my mood is better because I'm spending like half an hour just click, click, click,
it's
click.
very
Yeah,
soothing.
it really is.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love it. I got the Home Alone house. Like Michael got me the Home Alone house, which serves as a lovely little Christmas time decoration. And he
Mm.
also bought the light kit that you can get, like it's not an official Lego product, but it like lights everything up. So all the Christmas lights are on there, and it's so neat looking. And I put it out now at Christmas. It's amazing. So yeah, very addictive.
It is. Yeah. So do you have anything new in your life?
Yeah. I'm scared to say it. Um, I know I have a lot of cats, but I was like scrolling through Facebook and this picture of this cat came up that was like a senior cat. He's like 14 years old and his owner died, and the owner's husband, the lady's husband, couldn't take care of him, and so he's in the shelter and he was literally quote unquote terrified. That was the word they used. And he wasn't doing well, and I just my heart was broken and I just was crying for 2 days, and Michael's like, "Where is he? I'm going to go get him." And he's like, but you have to unfollow all of these groups on Facebook.
Okay. That's a fair deal. That's a
Yeah, I
fair
said,
deal.
I you're right. So I he's upstairs. Smokey. His name is Smokey. Um he's a little senior guy. He's like a little senior citizen. He's got the little old man face and like the little cat meow thing.
How's he fitting in with the rest of the gang?
Oh, well, he's not going to be meeting them for a while because that's a lot. I
Uh,
mean, that's a lot for
yeah.
humans. So, yeah, I can imagine. Um, yeah. So, but anyway, so um, I know like we're talking about our topic for the day, and I wanted to share some of the fun topic guesses that we got in various places. So Mike Alonso guessed our topic being the word Fallout.
Mm,
Mike Alonso said Night of the Comet, which I thought was a really good guess.
that is a
Um,
good guess. Yeah.
and of course, we famously have already kind of talked about Night of the Comet a couple of times, right?
Yeah, with Catherine Mary Stewart and Kelly Maloney live online, so it's
Yeah,
kind of it's hard to beat that, really.
that's true. And then Conan the Librarian guessed the band Fallout Boy, which
Ah,
was
okay.
fun. And then our friend Kieran said, "When celebrities cock up in public and the fallout that follows," which I think would be actually a really funny topic.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that one. That could be fun.
We'll put it on our giant list of topics. And then Keith Knight says, "The key words for me here are fallout and threads. Shivers down my spine."
Mm.
Um, so, to reveal what our topic actually is going to be about, I thought I'd start off with just a little background. So, Conrad, do you remember 1983?
I do, yes.
I think
Shockingly.
we were both 7-ish, right?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
were. So
So
old enough to have memories.
my brainstem was functioning by that point.
Yes.
Yeah, so I thought it might be funny to like show like a picture of us at that time. So here's a picture of me, or a couple pictures of me,
Oh,
circa 1983. One with my lovely tooth missing, and the other The one on the right is actually my dad made a haunted house at my school Halloween festival, and the whole top floor of the school got turned into a haunted house, and these were all like GIs and army guys that worked with my dad that helped him out and like dressed up in these amazing classic monster costumes, and so I had to get my picture with them.
Okay. Wow.
So yeah, and then you pulled a couple of fun photos as well, Conrad. Do you want to?
Yeah. Do you want it? Oh no.
So adorable. Look at you. Are you playing golf?
I'm playing golf. Yes. Well, just putting.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a standard thing to do when you're on holiday in the UK is to just do a little bit of putting. It's one of those things where your parents let you try all kinds of things to see what sticks. Spoilers, golf didn't stick.
But what about the little sweater around your shoulders? That is to die for. That look is on
Yeah.
on fleek. Like I love it.
It had to happen, didn't it, really? It was the 80s.
That preppy look was so in.
It
Well,
was.
yeah, and like we also like 1983 was like a blockbuster year for so many awesome things too that are like so quintessentially 80s. So I just made a slide of just a few of them because there are so many. So My Little Pony, of course, like
Mm.
my favorite, and then the Cabbage Patch Kid craze happened that year, and of course Return of the Jedi, which I don't know, I saw in the theater. Did you see it in the theater as well?
It's probably the first film I saw in the theatre, so I have memories of going to see two films in the theatre when I was very, very young. It was Return of the Jedi and Neverending Story, and Neverending Story was 84. So I think
Mhm.
Return of the Jedi is my first theatrical cinematic experience,
Wow.
and it had a big impact on me, as you can imagine. And my very, very first toy was a Scout Walker straight after seeing it, and my first batch of figures. So that's how I was bitten by the Star Wars toy bug.
Wow, that's really cool. I mean, I do remember seeing that with both my parents in the theater. It's
Mm.
probably my earliest memory, although I think I saw Bambi before this in the theater because they
Oh,
re-released it, periodically. And then of course He-Man was on, and I watched that religiously every day after school. Like
yep.
it
Same
was
here.
it was a thing for me for
Yeah.
sure.
But I always wanted Skeletor to win. That was the first sign of trouble, I think.
Well, after having gone through this topic with you, I believe you that you wanted skeletons. You're you're giving me a run for my money in the warped department, like, and that says something because most people when they get to know me, they're like, "Man,
No, you've met your
um,
match.
I have," which is amazing. So all of that as a background, like those were all things that our little 7-year-old selves were constantly thinking about. But what we were also thinking about in 1983 and 1984 was, of course, our topic for this week, which is Generation X and the nuclear nightmare. So, yeah, like
Yes.
Conrad, what was your like when do you think you started being afraid of nuclear war, like 80s kid style?
I think it was just something that I was always aware of. And especially being a military kid,
Hmm.
I always knew that I was living on a prime target. So my parents would always say to me that there was nothing to be afraid of because there would just be a flash of light and then I'd be gone.
Mm.
Somehow that wasn't quite as comforting
It
as
wasn't comforting to you?
they perhaps thought it was, but still, I mean, just as a generation, we did just grow up knowing that we could get that 30-second warning because, in the US you get the luxury of like half an hour or something, but here in the UK it's 30
Oh no,
seconds and we're toast.
you guys are close.
We're toast. So yeah, we're gonna get 30 seconds to like hug and yeah, we'll be gone. So and we always knew that we were always poised and were just waiting for this moment when we'd all be gone.
Right.
So yes,
Sure.
interesting way to
Well,
grow up.
well, it is, and I know that like this topic is a little uh, like scary to talk about or think about or anything like that, but it was such a huge part of most of our childhoods. Like on some level, I think so many of us thought about this a lot. And so what we've done here, and like we know it's kind of a bummer, but like don't be too worried. Like yes, there will be triggery things that we're talking about. So if you're really sensitive, like be aware. But we are also going to just kind of be we're going to be putting it in context, right? Like which is what we do, and we're going to be sort of bringing in all kinds of things that are related to it. So just we're going to hold your hand, we'll walk through it with you, but it is, just be aware that we're going to be talking about some stuff that's a little shocking, but you and I encountered this when we were 7 and we survived, and we're super normal. Like it didn't hurt us at all.
We're
So,
really well adjusted.
really well adjusted. Um, so leading into like obviously the 80s was sort of like the very final bookend on the Cold War, and the Cold War, of course, starting in the 2 to 3 years after the end of World War II. So kind of solidified really in 1947 through 1948. It definitely escalated with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was in October 1962. I talked to my mom a little bit about that, and she does remember it. She was 10 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and she said that she was definitely convinced that that there's going to be a horrible war, and she and my grandparents were just like convinced, and constantly having to wait till the news came on at like 6 o'clock at night and all gather around in the living room to listen to see like what had happened, which had to be a different kind of scariness, right?
Mm.
The first Gen X kids were born in 1965, so right after that. And thus, none of our generation really ever lived in a world without constant nuclear threat at a heightened level, not just sort of a low rumblings, but like red flashing lights kind of all the time. We had children's books like Z for Zachariah that came out in 1974, and Sadako and the Thousand Cranes, which came out in 1977, which of course was about World War II and the effects on a little girl of like, when she's exposed to nuclear fallout. But those were things that you could literally pick up at your school book fair. So certainly they weren't going to any great lengths to like shield us from that kind of content or that kind of information.
No. Interesting to see there that Z for Zachariah, which I'd never heard of before, is authored by Robert C. O'Brien, who also wrote Mrs. Brisby and the Rats of Nim.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, he was clearly a fun guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was really fun at parties, I'm sure. So I've been told I have to put my mic really close to my mouth. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, good. Sorry. Okay.
Back again.
I'm back again. All right. So why the peak in tensions in the 80s? So obviously in the 80s, things got worse, heightened, more stressful, lots more talk about nuclear war. And why was that? So certainly, and I'm not going to go too far into like politics, but these are all just facts. So Reagan became president in 81, like he took office in 81, and he began his presidency by escalating the Cold War and had a lot of new policies toward the Soviet Union, including he wanted to decrease the Soviets' access to high technology and diminish their resources. He wanted to increase American defense expenditures, and he wanted to force the Soviets to devote more of their economic resources to defense. So that was his strategy. But what you really saw was this massive American military buildup. And a lot of people all over the world, and certainly a lot of artists and people making content, were seeing, hey, we're suddenly ramping up the military a lot. And so it started becoming a topic of conversation in a lot of different realms, right? And I think there was a speech, right, that sort of like...
Yeah, 1983. It became known as the Evil Empire speech. And it was given by Reagan to the National Association of Evangelicals in March of 83, and he referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire and rejected the notion that the United States and the Soviet Union were equally responsible for the nuclear arms race and positioned the Cold War as a battle between good and evil, which, you know, generally as a way of dampening down tensions, that's not usually it. So
It's sort of
it,
like, how like Russia has like the emblem of a bear as like part of their imagery, and it's literally like he was poking the bear with a stick. He was just like poke, poke, poke.
yeah, exactly. And so that combined with, I mean, one essay that I read particularly pointed towards the announcement of the so-called Star Wars Defense Initiative,
Mhm.
Strategic Defense Initiative, which sort of untipped the balance between this mutually assured destruction, this idea that we all had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 50 times over, so nobody's going to launch them. Nice balance. But then if Reagan says, actually, I'm going to come up with something that means that you can't hit me, all of a sudden the balance is gone. So then you potentially put your enemies in the situation of, well, shall I wait for them to build it or just fire?
Right.
So that was the situation that we were left in, which meant that things were just generally quite tense and intense situations. Sometimes you have problems or false alarms, and there were quite a few of them. The most famous one, again, 1983, September of 1983. There was a guy in the Soviet Union who was manning his station watching the early warning radar for missile launches, and it started telling him that there was an intercontinental ballistic missile with 4 more missiles behind it from bases in the United States headed towards the Soviet Union. And we are all very lucky that this man was a very sober, calm, sensible individual, because he did not do what he was supposed to do, which is report this up the chain and then probably prompt a counterstrike. He waited. He suspected that that number of missiles must be an error in his equipment and sought confirmation, and he got confirmation that it wasn't real. And that man's name, who we should all thank, is Stanislav Petrov. He is no longer with us, sadly, but he lived long enough to be recognized when this story finally was declassified and we read about it many years later, and he received many prizes. Here's one that he received in Germany towards the end of his life. He was always very nonchalant about it and just said that he was just doing his job, and he didn't really think he was a hero for that. He just thought he was doing the right thing for his job.
So he was getting an award there. It looked like 2013. Do you happen to know, like, is that when it was declassified, or when did we find this out? Because I have heard it before, but it's been much more recently.
It is, yeah. It was in the 2010s that it finally
Okay.
came out. So, yeah, it was quite a long time after the Cold War ended and David Hasselhoff had torn down that wall that we found out some of these moments where we came very close to disappearing in a flash of bright white light, but for the sober and sensible decisions of one man.
Wow. Well, I do know, I remember that, and actually, if anyone's interested in that, you should go and look up list of nuclear close calls, and you'll see that it wasn't really an isolated incident, although I think it was potentially a bigger incident. Like it had the possibilities of becoming quite big. I'm going to hold this microphone. There we go. And so yeah, there were a lot of other discussions in the media about nuclear war as well. And I kind of remembered a few, but I went and looked them up because I just wasn't sure. So even sitcoms, which was like what was constantly being put in front of us back in the 80s, at least in America. I don't know if that was true there for you, Conrad, but we were constantly watching sitcoms. And so a couple that really stood out about this topic were Benson had an episode about it in 1985, and the
Oh, wow.
Golden Girls had one in 1987. And in Benson, of course, he is the assistant to the governor, and so in that one they are in a bunker and they are doing like a role playing exercise of like what would happen in the case of like a nuclear war. And you can see there on the table that they were sort of they were running a simulation that was a computer simulation. And in the Golden Girls, of course, Rose famously wrote a letter to Gorbachev that they thought was written by a little girl because it was so childlike. But what I learned so I watched the episode again and I do remember it, but she had, she's like the troop leader for like these little bluebird girls or whatever. They're sort of like Girl Scouts. And apparently this was something that was written to the president in reality. And it was something like, we as kids, we don't talk about what we're going to be when we grow up. We talk about what we're going to be if we grow up. And those were letters, like there were a lot of letters that were sort of leaked out to the media, and that was one of the things. And so I think the people who wrote that show literally pulled that from a real thing.
Right.
So yeah, that was all being discussed. And then of course we also everyone knows that like the person who really would always talk to us about topics that were hard to talk about and try to make sense of it all was Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, felt very strongly that kids needed to sort of have a dialogue about it because they were aware of it and it is scary. And so he did a 5-part, like, Mr. Rogers came on after school. So it was like a weekday show. And so on an entire week, so 5 episodes about conflict. So it wasn't specifically about nuclear war, but it was kind of obviously about war. And so through the segment on his show where he has like the puppets sort of having like an ongoing storyline that lasted the entire week, that whole storyline was about 2 towns, one town thinking that the other town was like getting all these supplies to make a weapon. But it turns out, of course, that the other town is actually trying to build a bridge instead of a weapon.
Oh.
And so they had just misconstrued why they were buying up all these supplies that could be very dangerous. And so he talks about all these things. But what's interesting about this is that you can find almost every single episode of Mr. Rogers except these 5 episodes. So I found it on like archive.org. I found the link and I downloaded those episodes just so that I could have them. But it's sort of like Mr. Rogers is available to stream even on a lot of different services, but not those episodes. So you have to kind of really dig around to try to find that if you're interested in watching.
That's really strange because I doubt he was, explicit.
No, he definitely. I watched it. I scrubbed through it, and I mean, it's Mr. Rogers. Like he's not being really overt, but he is talking about like how people can misconstrue things and how things can sort of ramp up because we're not communicating well, and how that makes things worse. And so he's talking a lot about trying to communicate and have empathy and all of the things that Mr. Rogers always taught us, right?
Yeah.
Did you guys have Mr. Rogers over there?
Not at all, no. Okay. So when Tom Hanks was trying to get an Oscar for being Mr. Rogers, we were all completely confused.
Right.
We had no idea who this man was.
To be fair, I was a little confused too, but Okay. And then of course, pop music had lots of sometimes hidden, sometimes overt messaging that had to do with like war and nuclear stuff. And like I was kind of scrolling through like what some of those songs might be, and I was kind of surprised. I was like, I didn't realize these songs were about this. I mean, it makes sense once you know it, but you would never have guessed it. Like the first one that came up was Nena. I don't know if I'm saying it right. 99 Luftballons.
Yes. Or 99 Red Balloons in its terrible English translation, which was much more popular here. I don't know about there.
No, I mean, I think I heard the German one, but I know they also played. I've heard both versions for sure.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I had this really bizarre false memory that they won the Eurovision Song Contest with this song. But it's not true, and I'm not alone because I googled it and it came up as a suggested question. So it's not just me that remembers this.
So this is a Mandela effect thing.
It is. It's a Mandela effect thing. It's a completely false memory that she won the Eurovision with this. She did not. Nicole did with a little piece, which was just as sickening. But this, the interesting thing with this is that 99 Luft Balloons is about people setting off balloons that get mistaken for UFOs, and the ensuing response to the UFOs causes some sort of war. Whereas the English translation, which Michael was saying just before we came on air, it scans terribly because it's just so badly written. And the band doesn't like it either. The English version makes it very explicitly that the balloons go up, and it's the balloons that cause a nuclear exchange, which is bizarre. But I mean, in our present day and age, balloons causing a war would not be much of a surprise, actually.
Wow. Topical.
There you go.
Well done. And that's why you watch us, folks. No, so there was also the novelty dance hit song from 1987, Walk the Dinosaur by Was Not Was, which I'm sorry. I thought this song was about just getting girls in skimpy dinosaur barbarian outfits to do a really cheesy line dance, but apparently not. I never really listened to the lyrics of the song because it just seemed like a dance fad cheesy song, like everybody was kung fu fighting, like on that level. But
Yeah.
I guess I can see like they're going to take us back to the Stone Age kind of mentality here, right? Like that's what they're going for.
Right. Okay. I did not realize.
I
I was just doing a dinosaur impression at weddings. Yeah.
And then we had this one is actually one of my favorite examples is the song by Timbuk3, which is whoops, that's not the right one. Sorry. We'll go with this one first. So Forever Young, I didn't realize was about, I guess you're forever young because you're gonna die young and you're never gonna get old.
Oh, nice.
I don't know. Like I guess that's what that's about. But yeah. So the next one is the Timbuk3, which is The Future's So Bright I Gotta Wear Shades, which that actually does make sense because obviously the flash of the bomb super super bright. It's even addressed in some of the stuff we're going to be talking about shortly. But I always remember, I don't know if anyone else remembers this, but there was a show called Head of the Class, and it was sort of it was another high school theme thing, but it was about the teacher in this high school classroom, and they did like a music video with that song, but it was super cheerful. It was
Right.
like, but when you listen to the lyrics of the song, especially the first verse, you can kind of hear what, you know, my it's like my chemistry teacher is a really cool dude, but he always wears shades and blah blah blah. Like it's sort of just sort of subtle, but now that you know that, it's like you know that.
Yeah. I read something where somebody said that the whole glowing in the dark thing was one of the reasons why neon was so popular in the 80s. It was kind of an ironic reference to The Future's So Bright, we gotta wear shades.
Ah, nice.
I'm
Nice.
not sure if
Well, I
that's
mean,
true.
that ties in nicely with our logo, doesn't it?
Doesn't it just?
Um, and then
Yep.
you had one that you brought up when I mentioned this idea, you had one that you brought up immediately.
Yes, I don't know. Any Brits watching might remember Ultravox's classic Dancing with Tears in My Eyes from 1984, which Midge the lead singer of Ultravox, said was inspired by Neville Shute's book On the Beach, which was about a group of people in Australia who see the global thermal nuclear
Mhm.
showdown in the northern hemisphere, and they're just waiting for the fallout to drift their way, and counting the days that they have left, really. It was turned into a film starring Gregory Peck, Eva Gardner, and Fred Astaire, and Anthony Perkins in 1959. I've never seen it. But in Ultravox's music video, instead it depicts the explosion of a nuclear power station. Not quite sure why, but I think it gives Midge time to get home to his wife, and they roll around in the sheets just before the explosion goes off in the big diaphanous curtains. So yeah,
Nice.
nice.
Well, I do know there is an Australian film that's from the 80s that's called, I think it's called One Night Stand or one something like that. And And it kind of ends the same way with them. Just they're in Australia and they're like watching, because I don't know if Australia is like on the top of the list to get bombed, but they're definitely going to
Apparently
get
not.
affected. They're going to get affected, right? So,
Yeah.
which leads us into the meat and potatoes of kind of what we're going to be talking about tonight. And I'm sure a lot of you guys will remember this, um, which is some of the TV movies that came out um, in the like 83, 84 time period. And in America, the first one, which that was like the big one that came out, was The Day After. And it was like this big deal that, it made the cover of TV Guide. And I remember seeing the TV Guide and sort of, again, my parents had these two recliners and they had like a little end table that sat in between them. And that's where the TV Guide lived. And I remember that for that entire week sitting there and just looking at it like kind of terrified because it's a terrifying image. And then, you know, everyone was talking about it. It was on the news. It was like everyone was talking about that. And I don't know if you remember this coming out, but it came out on November 20th, 1983 on ABC. It was like the Sunday night movie, and more than 100 million people watched the film during its initial broadcast, which I think it definitely held the world record for like the most people watching a TV program up at least until 2009. I can't imagine, that you would have a lot of people watching TV anymore, so it may continue to hold that record. But anyway, um, it's basically about what you think it's about. It's set in Kansas, so it's you're sort of everyman in America and how nuclear war affects them in the first. It's probably about like the 3 days leading up to, and then maybe the week after, really.
Right.
Um, and it stars Jo Beth Williams, Steve Guttenberg, Jason Robards, and John Lithgow. And it was directed, interestingly, by Nicholas Meyer, who, of course, a lot of people know from directing The Wrath of Khan, um, which also has some nuclear stuff in it, which we can talk about a little bit later. But I listened to a really interesting discussion that was filmed. It was like in front of a film school that Nicholas Meyer gave. Like back in like 2017 or so, and he was talking about sort of the behind the scenes drama of trying to get this thing made. And they had come to him. He was like the third or fourth director they had approached. Nobody wanted to talk about this because it's a bummer. It's like it's super depressing. And like I can speak to the fact that like I've been researching this stuff for like a month, and it is hard. It is hard to focus on. It is hard to like read about and just consume a lot of content about it. But he said he had this really interesting story where he said, he really didn't want to do it. He was talking to his therapist, and at the time, psychotherapy was very passive on the part of the therapist. And so you would just do all the work and lay there and say all of your problems. Well, this therapist, once he said, this has been pitched to me, I don't really want to do it, the therapist responded by saying, well, I guess now we get to find out who you really are.
Oh.
And so he was like, damn it, now I have to do it. Like, and so he then in turn went to like all of these people that he had worked with, like on The Wrath of Khan, like cinematographers, lighting people, like different people, and got them on board. And they were all like, no, I don't want to work on that project. That sounds like a huge bummer. And he was like, well, what, who are you? We're going to find out now who you really are. Like he kept using that line and hooking people with it. And, apparently like initially ABC wanted it to be a 2-night thing, and he was like, who's going to turn in for night 2 of the apocalypse? Like no one's going to watch. They were like, well, we're not going to make money on this anyway, we're just selling ad time. But eventually a lot of the ad people, like the I can't think of the word, but like the people who wanted to put ads in the shows were pulling out. So like sponsors were like, nah, I don't really want to be associated with that, because of course this was the early 80s in Reagan's America. So it was like a lot of people were pro-nuclear. Like they were,
Mm.
like Phyllis Schlafly and people like that were like going around on crusades saying, this is a terrible thing. We need to have a pro-nuclear voice making a TV movie too, and all this kind of stuff. And so it's just really interesting that he managed to, because they wanted to really censor him and they wanted him to like pad out a lot of the time so they could put more ads in it. But eventually, because so many people pulled out, he pretty much got to make the film he wanted to make. And from his
Mm.
perspective, he really tried to like not use really amazing cinematography because he didn't want to be accused of making it look fancy. He tried to keep it very flat and very boring in a way, and on purpose. And he used minimal music, although he did use some music. He said you have to make it somewhat digestible or people just can't get through it, which is not necessarily how other people approach this.
No.
So, and speaking of that, I'm going to turn this over to you to talk about the British version of the show.
Yeah, so I don't think we were aware of the day after. I certainly don't remember seeing it, whether it was repeated over here. But Keith Knight got it right. The key words for me here are fallout and threads. Threads was the corresponding event over here in the UK. It's exactly the same premise. It's normal everyday people in Britain, Sheffield specifically, which is a country, city up north, famous for its steel industry, and it's it's approached very much like a kitchen sink working class drama, and it was spearheaded by a director called Mick Jackson, who would later go on to a Hollywood career. He directed quite an odd range of films, actually. He did LA Story with Steve Martin, Volcano with Tommy Lee Jones, if anybody remembers that one, and Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston in The Bodyguard. So he went on to have quite a big career. But this was his early days in the BBC, and the reason he wanted to do the project was because he personally was deeply concerned about nuclear proliferation and what he perceived as a lack of awareness about it in the UK, or sort of an apathy among the public. There was this sense, certainly from the Greatest Generation and the Boomers, that, you know, with a bit of Dunkirk spirit and rationing, as long as we've got our Anderson shelter in the garden, we'll pull through. We did last time, it'll be fine. And everybody else was just trying not to think about it at all. So he recruited a writer called Barry Hines to write it because he wanted to depict a modern working class community, people that the average audience member could relate to. And Hines was best known for his work with Ken Loach, who sort of spearheaded this whole kitchen sink realist movement in film, principally with Kes, which was based on Barry Hines' book Orchestral for a Knave, which came out in '69. And the two-part television drama The Price of Coal is quite seminal in that field. Hines didn't want to do it. So he was, it was a different thing, and unlike the director being the one that didn't want to do it, it was the writer that didn't. But then he started to think about somebody else doing it and them doing it badly. So he did it out of a sense of duty to try and do it justice. It was shot on a budget of £400,000, which is a very small budget, but hey, it's the BBC, which is about $300,000 in 1984 money. And it depicts the effects of nuclear war on Sheffield, which takes a direct hit, centres on two families and some star-crossed lovers, played by Karen Meager, who is a newcomer at the time, and Rhys Dinsdale, who became famous co-starring with John Thor in a situation comedy called Home to Roost, which I remember quite fondly. It was gritty. It took almost sort of a semi-documentary approach because it sort of flicks between the action and a narrator and facts and figures about exactly what is happening and how much damage it's doing. And the span of time it covers is more. It covers 14 years.
Oh yeah, it's insane how much time is covered in this movie.
Yeah, but it's kind of half an hour of lead up, about 10 minutes of the actual attack, and it sort of telescopes out. And as time goes on, it's just sort of like, well, here's 10 years later and things are even worse. You know,
Yeah, it's also like 2 hours long. So unlike
yeah.
the day after, it's at least 30, 40 minutes longer. Um,
It
so
is, and you mentioning about sponsors. I mean, one of the key differences here. This was shown on BBC. It wasn't shown on BBC One because we only had three channels back then.
sure, yeah,
It,
same.
it it was not shown on the channel that everybody is on by default in the evening to watch their soaps in a row. It was shown on BBC Two, which is what was known as the elective channel. You would choose to watch this, so this would be where the arty stuff was, and I think that was their compromise to make sure that they didn't startle the audience too much, because quite famously, it was it's been viewed as the BBC's attempt at redemption after suppressing a similar project many years before. A very famous documentarian called Peter Watkins had made a film called The War Game in 1965, which depicted the effects of a nuclear attack on Kent.
Hmm.
And it won the Best Documentary Feature at the 1967 Oscars. It was a very good, startling, disturbing piece of work. So disturbing that unfortunately when the BBC saw it, they had a heart attack, showed it to the Home Office, and they did a little bit of finagling and finally managed to find a way to make it quietly disappear and not broadcast it. It was released sort of theatrically in like the British Film Institute for sort of a discerning audience who could obviously be trusted. But there was genuine concern that people would watch it and kill themselves. That
Right.
it was that disturbing.
Which
It doesn't.
we
We've
watched
watched.
it. It's not. It's well. I mean, I guess at that time, probably.
Yeah, it doesn't retain its power, but it's certainly it's a fascinating, seminal, and groundbreaking piece of work.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's very 60s, right? So it's sort of like a pseudo documentary, like you said. And so part of it is like man on the street stuff, and part of it, and
Yeah,
this we're talking about the 60s movie, not the Threads movie. But it's,
yeah,
you know, some of it is like, and then the bomb hit, and so which is sort of like a fictitious thing. It's a little confusing, honestly, but I can see that like they're trying to show like this is what it would look like on your TV set and in your life if this were to happen, which is what all of these are doing essentially.
yeah. It is. Now you mentioned that the day after was on the cover of your TV guide. Threads also appeared on the front cover of our TV guide, so that this would be the Radio Times in in the UK, because for some reason the BBC produced its own TV news, TV listings guide, and ITV, the other channel, the competing channel, had theirs, the TV Times. So at
Wow.
Christmas you had to buy both and get a highlighter pen to sort of figure out which shows you wanted to watch and which ones you wanted to tape, and it caused a bit of a stir because it's a disturbing cover image of somebody who's heavily bandaged because of their radiation sickness, wearing a traffic warden uh, a
Yeah.
uniform,
Yeah.
but bearing a gun, which is very unusual in the UK. So this sense of a police state. So yeah, it disturbed people, and so it got letters in the Radio Times. And yes, Mrs. Grace Harland of Reigate, Surrey, complained, please couldn't we always have something pleasant or cheerful on the Radio Times cover? After all, it stays around the sitting room for a week, and one doesn't want a week's reminder of ugly things. I've just had to paste over your Threads cover with Terry Wogan for want of anything better. And this continued the following week with John Hodgkinson, who is my hero, writing in to say, the letters pages so often contain useful advice. My thanks to Mrs. Grace Harland. I shall keep the Threads cover ready to paste over the next one featuring Terry Wogan. So yeah, bit of a war. Terry
Wow.
Wogan, for the uninitiated, was a popular TV host, DJ on Radio One, and game show host, and a lovely guy. And he always used to do the commentary in the UK for the Eurovision Song Contest, and he was always a little bit sarcastic, and sometimes it got him in trouble because he was making fun of the whole proceedings, whereas the Europeans were taking it desperately seriously.
Oh, well, of course. Yeah.
But yes, this film was a cultural phenomenon in the UK. I remember seeing it at school.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
shown to us in school.
I feel like I remember people talking about this movie, but only like did you hear about it? Like my parents wouldn't let me watch it. Like my parents were really lenient. Okay, I watched a lot of stuff that I probably shouldn't have, but my mom, I think the deal was with my mom was like I am not watching that. That looks horrifically terrifying and stressful and like a bummer. And so she didn't watch it, so therefore I didn't watch it. So I think that's
Right.
really what
Okay.
happened. But I meant to show this picture. It's got a few stills from the day after in it. So in the movie, you know, you've got people living in a basement, like during the like whole thing. So they're all dirty and gross and horrible, starting to experience some radiation stuff. Of course, Steve Gutenberg famously has his hair all fall out. This was back when he
Yes.
was, you know, very like young. Like he was pretty young in '83, so kind of a cute guy. And by the end, he looks absolutely wrecked. Um, and there's like the way they handle showing the bomb hitting is they show like these weird quick flash scenes of like people doing stuff and then they all just go red like as in Night of the Comet red filter and they turn into skeletons, which is almost comical. Like I kind of
Yes.
laughed, and this particular scene is a wedding, so it's like a couple standing outside and like but like she turns into a skeleton but her dress is intact. It's really weird. It's an interesting image, and I'm not trying to knock Nicholas Meyer because obviously, you know, he had a budget and he had, you know, all sorts of things, but I just it's these days it's very funny. And then the other thing that I noticed that was in this movie that I didn't see in any of the other fare that I watched was the bombs taking off from America.
Mm.
So most of the time, everyone is depicting themselves as the victim only. But this interestingly showed us as, you know, it doesn't make it clear necessarily who struck first in this movie. And I think that was intentional, but it does show that we definitely also did the same thing. So we don't, while we don't see what happens on the other side of those, we know that that is ongoing as well, which I
Right.
thought was an interesting choice direct
It
from a
is.
director perspective.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen in Threads. Sheffield was in particular chosen as the location for Threads because it was famously a nuclear-free city.
Mm,
So
yes.
that yeah, there wouldn't be anything launching from there, and
Right.
it meant that the local council was very accommodating to the filming, and a lot of the people there were very keen to get involved too. So when
Mhm.
they put out a call for extras to appear in crowd scenes, they thought they might get a couple dozen show up at the town hall, and yeah, they ended up with 1,100. So
Okay. Well,
yeah,
I mean, it's interesting when you hear behind the scenes stuff about like people wanting to participate in this because some people were like, "Oh, it just sounds like it'll be fun," and then some people were like, "This was terrifying, and I'm never gonna sleep the same again." Like that's true of like the people who were extras in it the day after, for example.
yeah, I
Yeah.
can imagine it was an experience that stayed with you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So,
Mm.
I think that you mentioned that Threads actually won an award, right? Like,
It
um,
did. It was nominated for 7 BAFTA awards in 1985, and it won for Best Single Drama, and as well as that Best Design, Best Film Cameraman, and Best Film Editor. So yeah, multiple award-winning movie.
well done, UK. Well done.
Mm.
So as we both watched both of these films and several others, weirdly, but um, we kind of I thought it might be interesting for us to kind of go through and sort of compare and contrast how
Mm.
America versus the UK decided to approach this topic, because some of it is it's interesting. I think that's to me that's where some of the biggest interest stuff comes in. So we made a big spreadsheet that won't surprise anyone,
Of course we did.
um, because how else are you going to do it, right? And so we kind of got we'll share our list. So um, and we're not going to go like line by line necessarily, but this just sort of gives you an idea of like, you know, some of these things. So I thought we would point out the ones that are interesting. So I think some of the stuff that is the same as like, okay, we have previous survivors of war or conflict. So, the day after and Threads both focus on the fact that some of the people involved have already survived war. So like you said, the idea is, oh well, it's not a big deal. We just, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we can survive it. We survived it last time, so it's not a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's
Yes, it's just slightly diluted
it's
there.
not really the same thing, but
No,
um
no.
but
But
anyway,
you can understand why, because they'd gotten through something pretty horrific, and felt that they were ready for anything. So
yeah, for sure. Um, so I'm gonna do it like this. And
that's better.
so in terms of the things that jump out at you, what is the thing that jumps out at you about this list?
Well, the spine of the stories is very similar. You have a young couple on the verge of getting married in both of them. Um, I think there's pregnancy in both cases, isn't there?
Yes.
It, yes, the female protagonist is pregnant. So they're planning for the future together, which is always the way, isn't it? It's like a war movie. When as soon as somebody shows you the picture of their girlfriend back home, you know they're toast. May as well put a
Well,
red shirt on.
yeah, and the difference would be that, in the day after it's more they're planning for their wedding,
Mm,
whereas there is a secondary character that's like a nurse character who is actually 9 months pregnant and about because the time span of the movie is much shorter in the day after, whereas in the
mm,
British version the woman found out she was pregnant and that's why they're getting married. So she's very early on in her pregnancy, but the movie ends when this kid is like 14 years old. So there's like a much different timetable that we're talking about in the
yeah,
British version.
yeah, that's very true. Yeah, they also have this same approach to their um, denying the severity of the situation. Both of them have it happening in Berlin around the wall, not
Hmm.
surprisingly. Although in Threads, I think the focal point of the flare up is in the Middle East. It's in Iran, which is
I think they
interesting.
both have both of those things,
Yeah. Okay.
but to differing degrees and in slightly different narrative ways. But those because those were the things that were happening in the world at the time. Just so, of course, that's what they do. It is interesting that, of course, the U.S. version shows military personnel, whereas the British sort of does,
It
but not
sort
as
of
much.
does. It's not military, so you don't follow the military response at all. You see the creation of a police state after the war has happened.
Right.
But beforehand, the only thing you get to see really is some privileged businessman who obviously has been given the task of being a regional emergency uh, sort of council leader, and he's the one that has to assemble various people to look after, food, transportation, infrastructure, and all this kind of thing, and get them into a bunker underneath Sheffield Town Hall, which they end up trapped in under the rubble, and they suffocate in there eventually. Having achieved very little as far as I can tell. So the ineffectuality of leadership, I think, is common to both of them. I think there is a sense that they get cut off from
Yeah.
official leadership and have to fend for themselves, the people that are surviving. But yeah, no, there's really isn't a military story to Threads at all.
No, and it almost feels like there may have been more of a military story in the day after, but it sort of just drops off. Like there's one military person who you see having to say goodbye to his wife and young daughter, I guess. And he has to go out on this assignment. He ends up sort of going AWOL at the very last minute because he realizes that everyone's launched their weapons, so he's like, I can do whatever I want, and I'm not climbing down in that bunker because this is where they're going to strike. So he was running away from the nuclear missile bunker, and spoiler alert, he doesn't make it. So like most people in the movie like really don't make it. Like the American one less so. Like you because the UK one is so long, like pretty much everyone has a horrific outcome.
Yeah.
Hashtag bummer. Um,
Yeah.
but there was definitely like both of them had like what is definitely relatable if you've ever been through any kind of even like a hurricane or like down here where I live, we get a lot of hurricanes. Certainly back when I lived in Alabama, all the time. So the supermarket scene really hit me where I live because it's like, okay, that is literally what happens is people going buying all the bread and milk and
Yeah.
and it's chaotic and like it looks like the pandemic store situation where the shelves are just empty, but back then that was not normal. Like you would never imagine that would be the case. So people just buying up all the batteries, buying up all the bottled water, all that kind of stuff.
Was it
um,
really sort of panicky during COVID for you guys
oh
over
my
there? Because
god, was
here
it
in the
not for
UK,
you?
well, no, you know what we're like. We queued, you know.
Oh well, you know what we're like, we did not.
No, you were probably gunning each other down on the way to the
that's
toilet paper aisle.
that's
Oh, I'm being rude.
You're kidding. No,
I'm
but
kidding.
people were like hoarding stuff and panic buy. There's a lot of panic buying. So
Yeah.
people here just tend to panic and then run and buy like 50 of something. And so I think that was going on and that caused a ton of the initial shortages. So
Okay.
there were definitely a lot of things you could not find for probably a year.
Yeah, same here. But we were queuing, so they would own. There was a government ruling that supermarkets could only have a certain number of people in the store at any given time. So
Yeah.
we were queuing up, and they would sort of let one person in for every one person that came out. It
They did
was
that for a brief period here, but it doesn't go over great here to do
no,
that. So
I can imagine it
anyway,
doesn't. But yes, you have to have a supermarket scene. It's de rigueur in this kind of movie, I
absolutely.
think.
And then of course the traffic, you sort of see people getting in their cars in threads, but in the day after you definitely see like gridlock, which again hit me because when you have hurricanes like in Florida, everyone flees the state and they start coming up into Alabama and Georgia. And so you have like the interstates just being absolute parking lots of just people desperately, and the storm is coming and they're trapped in their cars. And it's like, you would have been better if you're going to wait that long to like stay at your house because now you're in a car on a freeway.
Yeah.
um, it's just always really tricky. So yeah, and I've witnessed that so many times living in the South. So and then you have like obviously I don't know if we have it on here, but like the news reports like are in the background while everybody's just kind of trying to like ignore it because nobody wants to think about it. Nobody wants to address it or really give it credence because it's like, well, I don't want to overreact now and then like have wasted my time and money or whatever preparing for this thing that isn't really going to happen, and they want to believe it's not going to happen. So the news reports are just sort of their underlying conversations about like, oh well, the wedding's tomorrow and we have to get the pie ready and da da da. There's just in
Yeah.
all of these movies that is get ready for it because it's going to happen for like an
It,
hour.
yeah, and in Threads, the main male character, the young guy that's getting married, Jimmy, played by Reese Dinsdale, he's concerned about it, but his best friend is just concerned about picking up a couple of ladies that are in the local pub
Hmm.
to have one final night of fun before he gets married. Which, yeah,
Which he does.
which he does. Yeah, Jimmy is, yeah, not
Jimmy
faithful.
sucks. Let's just be honest.
So yeah, so when he disappears shortly after the bombs start to fall, I don't, I don't know if anybody's particularly sad, but
It
yeah,
kind of
poor
took the edge
Ruth.
off of it, honestly. Like I wasn't sad that Jimmy just kind of disappeared. Like you don't see what happens to Jimmy, but yeah, I mean, you kind of know, right? Like you don't need to see it.
Yeah, so he starts running back to the house after the first bomb goes off. So you know when the second one goes off that's yeah, Jimmy's toast. I think.
I'm sorry to laugh, but it's just you kind of have to start having a warped sense of humor with this stuff.
I think you do. Yeah,
So the emergency alerts begin. Those things terrify me. The sound of those things terrifies me. Um,
Yeah. It's
yeah,
meant to, so it's kind of a
yeah. So a lot of
Pavlovian
these things.
response.
So people, and we'll skip over some of the things that are on the screen right now, but people not saving their pets. So as you know, me being the animal person that I am, I was pretty much screaming at the screen like all the time with any of the animal stuff that was going on in these movies. Um, so you have like, let's see, I've got it right here. So in the day after, you have this poor dog who the family like literally kind of on purpose locks him out of the cellar where they're all hiding from the bomb because they just don't have enough food and water they say for him. And then
Oh,
in threads, the little girl's desperately trying to get her dog before she gets in the car, and the guy's like, "We don't have time to wait for him. You know, whatever. It doesn't matter." And luckily, the little dog comes running up at the last minute. Of course, that's not going to save him, but at least he's there with his family instead of just left behind.
yeah.
So it's just kind of like a very brutal. It's a way that filmmakers are sort of tugging at your heartstrings, but in a way where it's not like, you know, as horrible as like children being injured or whatever. So
Which Threads does.
oh, 100% they do. Like you guys are hardcore. So the next list of stuff, it's like we've got one thing that was interesting that was different was in the day after you've got John Lithgow as like a science professor or head of a science department at the local university, and so he gets into one of the buildings that's sort of got an underground like area, and he starts monitoring, like building a thing where he can monitor the radiation levels, and he also gets on like a CB radio, so he's able to communicate with the hospital. So I feel like the American version employs, not only do they have a lot of people who are knowledgeable about specialty areas. So they have like a doctor character and a science character to allow the audience to be exposed to that type of information organically through the story. Whereas Threads is just normal people who don't really know a lot about those things. And so you, as the audience, also don't get to know about those things.
No, you do get, which is formally a bit that's different between the two movies, is that Threads has a narrator who pops up with screens with graphics. It's sort of like the dark version of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It just comes up with this, yes, 210 megatons have fallen on the UK. Uh, and the whole system of agriculture has collapsed. So lovely, thank you. So yeah, that's the way that information is imparted in Threads is via the voice of the BBC.
Mm, yeah. Well, another thing that really jumped out at me, and not only these two movies, but like other movies that we watched, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is the woman having to be pulled into the cellar or into
Always.
like the hiding place, because the female characters in these in general are like they are busying themselves with chores, like household chores, like whether it's baking or cleaning or whatever woman's work thing they're doing, obsessively to try to block out the horror of what is happening around them.
Yeah.
And while that is totally valid and probably what a lot of people would do, it's also like it starts to become a very like discernible trend in all of these where you're just like, I mean, because I know when we've had like tornadoes here, for example, and we all like we get the cats and we get ourselves and we come down here where there's like it's underground and there's dirt on all the sides and so there's no windows, and we get in this room and we're both working together, like Michael's getting stuff and I'm getting stuff and we've got a checklist and we're checking in and we're both equal. Like, I don't know, it's a weird idea. Like, how did that strike you?
It's a common dramatic. I mean, you have to have conflict in order to have drama. So one of the ways they choose to have drama is to have the woman have some sort of hysterical meltdown, which I think is just a sign of the times. I'm not sure that you would You would get it now. Certainly, I can't imagine Michael having to slap you around to get your attention during a hurricane. I just can't see that happening.
No, no. Well, and also the idea of the woman becoming hysterical and running out of the cellar. So it's sort of like the especially in the day after the the girl, the daughter character who was going to get married the next day just has like a meltdown, like, and she just runs out into like post bomb explosion, like maybe a couple days later or maybe even just one day later, she runs out into the field and she's just
Yeah.
like hyperventilating and clearly having like a freak out. Like she's not in her right mind, which understandable on one hand, but like Steve Gutenberg's character has to run out after her, and it's sort of implied that because she ran out into the field and he was like, you guys took me in, because again, he's just a hitchhiker who sort of was looting in their house, and they heard him and they were going to kill him, and they were like, no, you can come down here with us. He feels that they saved his life, and so he's like, I owe you one. I'll go get her when she runs out. And so the two of them run out into this field because this guy's a farmer. It's the guy who was like the old man on Northern Exposure who was married to the teenage girl, which is really gross and
Oh.
creepy. But his name was like Halling on Northern Exposure. And every time I see him, that's who I think of. But yeah, so Steve Gutenberg runs out, saves the girl, but they both get this like lethal dose of like radiation because it's like right in the middle of like the bad time to go outside when she decides to freak out. So it's kind of like her fault, right? That Steve Gutenberg's hair falls out, and
Yeah.
like it's her fault. Um
Oh, yeah. Whereas Ruth in Threads decides to leave the basement that she's in with her parents and her grandparents. I think partly just because I don't know, I feel like she just gets the sense that this isn't the answer, that this is not going to work out well for her. Also, I think she wants to find Jimmy. I think she's fairly clear that he's dead at that point, but she just wants to look for him. So she goes wandering through Sheffield, which is probably one of the most haunting parts of the movie where she's walking through the rubble,
yeah,
which
and that's where you
was,
start seeing like the dead piling up, and like you eventually start seeing like the mass graves and like all these things that start happening and firing squads and like, oh, like
yeah,
it's like
yeah.
real bad. And then I think we may have already gone past the panic in the streets thing, but this was right after the supermarket thing. But we've got like people like fleeing, whereas like in the day after, and like this is, it looks like huge hordes of people, whereas the BBC may have been on a little more of a budget.
A little bit more of a budget, so you've just got sort of a couple dozen people running past Burton's and Woolworths. Um, but it was what they could do. I mean, they did pretty well. They were given to create the sort of the wreckage of Sheffield. Sheffield actually gave them a housing estate, a council housing estate that was due for demolition anyway, and they just demolished it for them and burnt parts of it and stuck dead animals in it. Well, pretend dead animals in it, and
So what you're saying is they didn't have to do a lot to make it look like post-apocalyptic.
no, just a council estate in Sheffield in the
Okay.
1980s, and
Okay.
you were pretty much there. Just just a little bit of soot, and you were done. Yeah, it was quite funny while they were making the film, apparently, because it was so trashed. This area was uninhabited. It was used as sort of a place to get spare parts. So people would, if they needed a new door, they would just pop in, unscrew one, and walk off with it. Well, of course, they went in, the movie people, and started building sets in these houses and renovating them. And then when they went home, they would come back the next day and half of it would be missing. So they had to take it down at the end of every day and take it with them.
Wow.
Otherwise, yeah, the
Looting
locals
is
would
real.
looting is real in the depraved areas of the north during the 80s, because the 80s was not a great time in the UK.
Mm.
It was not
Yeah,
a
well, I mean, I
an
would
affluent
argue that
time.
it sort of wasn't great here either, depending on where you were.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I mean, we talked about the bombs going off, but And they both kind of use similar. They had sort of similar looking techniques to sort of make that happen visually.
Yeah.
And it looks like, sort of like dual, some sort of like you have two different, like not cameras, but like layers of image that you're sort of overlaying some stuff
Yeah.
to make that
I mean,
mushroom cloud.
they did pretty well, really, with the
Yeah.
resources they had at the time. I mean, one's a TV movie, which is never going to have a big budget. And the other one is the BBC, which is certainly never going to have a big budget. But you compare this to, say, Doctor Who episodes at the time,
Uh-huh.
and it's pretty hard hitting. I mean, the bomb sequence, even now, but I think that's down to Mick Jackson's craftsmanship in terms of his choice of images, also the sound design. There's some very cunning moments in it where the sound goes completely and you're just listening in silence to just these nightmarish images of people on fire. And it's even now,
Yeah.
it's pretty breathtaking
I
when
would
you
say,
watch it.
like, so Conrad like sent me this message right before I watched Threads, and our good
Mm.
friend Scott Hughes had just serendipitously sent us a Blu-ray copy of Threads. So I already had like the Blu-ray copy. I was sitting down to watch it, and Conrad had sent me a message saying, I watched it the other day, and it's very dated, and it's really not that bad. Like it's just kind of comical in some ways, and I'm watching it absolutely aghast. Like, I'm horrified. Michael walked through the room and he's like, "Oh my god, what in the world?" And I told him what you said, and he was like, "I'm gonna have a conversation with Conrad. I'm really concerned about Conrad." Like,
Yeah.
if he like, what does it take for Conrad to think it's really bleak and bad if this movie is not? But I will say, like, in terms of tonal differences between The Day After and Threads, The Day After feels like it's not lighthearted. It's dark and it's depressing, but it's got more of the trappings of a normal movie with like a little bit of score and like some stuff like that. Whereas Threads feels a lot closer to something like Come and See, which I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but it's a Russian film about what happened during World War II in Belarus, with the SS going in and just wholesale slaughtering villages. And it employed some of the same tactics that you're talking about in terms of like going completely without any sound at all, because
Yeah.
a bomb drops near this kid, and so he can't hear, so you can't hear, and all you can hear is that high pitched sound when your ears are ringing, and that's the soundtrack of that whole section of that movie. So things like that, it feels a little bit more stripped down and even more bare bones in Threads, and the images they're showing are, I mean, they are horrific. We didn't even pull slides of them because it's just so upsetting to look at.
No, there's little bits of it that stay with you as an adult, or having not watched it again in many, many years until we were preparing for this. All I remember as a kid, there were two things that stuck with me. One was somebody, a woman wetting herself in the middle of the street
Yeah.
when the bomb drops, and a scene towards the end where Ruth has her child, which I see you have here. Pregnant woman gives birth, and Ruth has her child on Christmas Day, for all the symbolism therein, and she's in a stable. So that's where we're at in terms of
I
economy
mean, it's
and
like,
stages of development.
you don't have to beat us over the head with the irony movie. Like, we get it. It's horrible, and
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty dire, but yeah, she gives birth obviously without any kind of medical support whatsoever,
yeah,
and she's got to cut that umbilical cord somehow. So yeah, she chews it,
choose it
and
off. Yep,
she chews it off. That sticks with you.
it
It
does.
was
I will say
so.
it stuck with me.
Yes, I can imagine. So I can tell you that was actually licorice, because Bassett's licorice all sorts were manufactured nearby.
Chewy.
Sheffield.
Um,
So Mick Jackson went to Bassett's Licorice All Sorts and said, "Can you make me an umbilical cord?" And they said,
wow.
"Yeah, sure." So
That had to
there
be
you
a
go.
weird conversation.
Yeah, no, they were ready to produce the Bassett's licorice umbilical cord, so limited edition.
The they also did like, well, they showed a lot of hospital stuff in both movies,
Mm,
but differently. So in Threads, of course, there aren't any medical characters. So you have Ruth sort of walking through the nightmare landscape of what a hospital would look like when you have no power, no supplies, no electricity, like no ability to sanitize anything, no more drugs. And so, you get things where it's like, in the day after, it looks a lot more like the fields in Gone with the Wind, where you've just got people laying in like a big open area, whereas in Threads, you've got people sort of hovering in hallways more, with their injuries and just sort of like crowding together. I don't know for what purpose, but I would just give up and leave personally, but
yeah, exactly. Actually, Mick Jackson was a bit critical of Nicholas Meyer, who he respects. He
Mhm.
pointed out that he does respect him as a filmmaker, but he was critical of the approach of having a crane camera following Steve Gutenberg instead of Scarlett O'Hara and slowly lifting up to reveal the scale of the injuries, the wounded and the sick. So he felt that that was too sort of grandiose and filmic a moment, that referencing Gone with the Wind completely undermined the seriousness of the material.
Well, I don't know. I feel like, I feel like it may be a valid criticism, but at the same time, consider the audience for the
Yeah,
film. It's like it's going to have probably the impact on an American audience that it's not going to land the same way outside the US. Like,
yeah,
it just won't. But I think it probably is effective in showing like the volume of people. Like, and there were a number of scenes that were in The Day After that showed huge groups of people, which they just got local citizens to come in. They put all the stuff on them, and there are interviews you can go on YouTube and watch the people who were like walk-ons on this movie set talking about what it was like, and they're all dirty and bandaged up and fake blood on them and stuff like that, and they would just be kind of sitting there not speaking in the background just to kind of fill in the horror of what's going on. But I think America thinks big, like we just that's how we think, whereas I feel like the story of Threads is much smaller and impactful in a different way, like in a more visceral way, I think, like, or gut wrenching way.
yeah. I think you're right, and I think it's it is tailoring it to the audience. It's trying to get your message across and have the impact by doing something that will resonate with the audience,
Sure.
and that will resonate with the US audience. In the UK, something that looks sort of like characters from Coronation Street in their terrible grotty 80s homes, eking out an existence in a rural wasteland, would
Hmm.
resonate. It would be something that would work. Whereas something as grandiose as that, with music behind it, with snare drums and a solo trumpet, would just Brits would just like switch off at that point.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, honestly, I was kind of not in love with the musical score there, but I can see probably why they did it. Like, he didn't want it to be
Yeah.
too sentimental. He did say he intentionally chose something that was less sentimental and syrupy, and it feels a little more militaristic in a way
Hmm.
to me.
Yeah.
But speaking of filmmaking perspectives, let's talk about some of the intentional choices that the directors made that were different or the same, and how that makes these films land differently. So they both have flyovers of the area to show the landscape being very different, obviously, between The Day After and Threads. And I know in the Day After it's like Kansas, so you're talking like fields and cows and just like you feel like it's America for Americans. Like it's very like pickup trucks and you know it's so like apple pie middle America 80s thing, like the little tiny white church and like girls in little dresses, and it's just it's so on the nose, and I think it's on purpose. Like I'm not
Yeah,
even
definitely.
it's absolutely intentional, but of course Threads has a totally different landscape with Sheffield, right?
It does, yeah. So that it kicks off with Ruth and Jimmy parked in a car overlooking the whole city, and the city is, it's an industrial city and a place for the working class. So it's not a rural rolling valleys and hills
Yeah, so what that's saying is the
situation.
working class in America lives in the country, whereas in Britain
Yeah,
they live in the city, because you
yeah,
guys were still doing more like factory type stuff, whereas a lot of our stuff is like farming and things like that.
yeah. I guess so. So again, it's speaking to the audience, giving
That's
them
right.
something they would recognize. And we've talked about the music, of course. Day After has music by a composer from the Golden Age, David Raksin.
Mhm.
Raskin? Not sure how you pronounce it.
Not sure either.
No. Whereas Threads has none.
Yeah,
None at all.
none.
No.
That's what how I feel like, again, it's kind of like Come and See, which is a horrific, life-changing movie also about war, but
Yes.
not about nuclear war.
Yeah. Drama intercut with news reports to raise tension. Very much a great device at the beginning. Slightly different in Threads, which I've mentioned here, is that it has a narrator for portions
Mhm.
of it with facts and figures. The sort of Hitchhiker's Guide to Nuclear War keeps popping up occasionally. The interesting thing with it that they pointed out in the commentary, which I hadn't seen, which is you notice that the narrator disappears at a
Mhm.
certain point, and it's the point at which government breaks down. So the voice of the BBC goes from the movie at the
Yes.
point in which there's no authority left. So then you're just watching Ruth going blind,
Wandering through, eating
scrabbling,
eating dead animals on the side of the road, and
yeah, trading her body for rats.
yeah.
Yeah.
Good times, everybody. Good times. Happy
You're just
Saturday.
so brave.
Um, the the main protagonist being male, which that's it is interesting because in The Day After you have the doctor um
The
character,
professor.
you have the professor who is John Lithgow, and then you have the farmer guy who is the guy from Northern Exposure. Those are kind of the three main male characters, and they do have like female characters that are sort of right next to them, being in supportive roles. Um, but it really is sort of driven by the male characters, whereas Threads is definitely a Ruth centric story. Like certainly by the time the bomb, like you have the two families and you have Jimmy and Ruth and each of their parents, but it very quickly becomes just about Ruth because everybody else is just gone.
Yeah, Jimmy vanishes. The parents perish. In one case, looters murder them.
Hmm.
Um, and Ruth is left to fend for herself with her child in tow. So
I have
you
to
get to
say,
follow Ruth.
oh, sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, you do, and it's interesting to see how a woman is navigating all of that.
Mm.
I see so many parallels with this, and we can't even go off onto this tangent, but there are a ton of parallels between this and most of the '80s zombie movies that I like to think of. Um,
Yes. Night of the
and
Comet
so
included.
exactly, Night of the Comet, but also all the Romero films, like
Mm.
certainly Dawn of the Dead. I'm thinking, and even Day of the Dead
Yeah.
with the military aspect worked in there. So yeah, just really interesting sort of to think about how those movies tell a lot of different stories about like consumerism and stuff, but I feel like there's also a tinge of the nuclear terror that is in there as well.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
yeah, so in terms of, we've talked about a lot of the themes, like what was it like for kids? Going back to the beginning, what was it like for kids growing up with a nuclear threat hanging over us in the '80s? So I know I have to say, and I have to say this for obvious reasons, but for me, I reacted like when I first heard Megadeth, So Far So Good So What, that album, it really landed with me so heavily because it was so clearly talking about nuclear war, quoting that whole Einstein thing, which is unclear if he actually said that, and several other things. Even the name of the band, Megadeth, has to do with nuclear war. The other big album, of course, from the 80s that I listen to a lot, I know there are a ton of them in heavy metal, especially, but Ozzy's The Ultimate Sin, there are numerous songs just on that album alone about nuclear war. And of course, the cover, as you can see here, has, the bomb going off in the background. There's literally a song on that album called Thank God for the Bomb. So,
Oh,
um, you know, it's sort of at that point in my life, that was around 88. Um, I really started focusing heavily on music that talked about nuclear war because it just was this thing that was just always there. And so, like, even when Metallica made "And Justice for All," and like the first song on that album is "Blackened," and it's them talking about, all like what the world's going to look like at the end. And I could do a whole show about all the different metal stuff, but that really played a heavy role into me going toward heavy metal as like a thing, because I was like, this is serious, this is something that somebody needs to be talking about. And I know we pointed out that even Was Not Was talking about nuclear war, but they weren't talking about it as overtly as I wanted somebody to talk about it. I want people to be aware this is really bad and somebody needs to do something about it. So anyway.
yeah. And I think I didn't have that kind of outlet, but certainly, as I said before, it's something that we were always aware of, and that we were sort of my parents sort of softly tried to prepare me for, what will we do in those last few seconds. It was something that you would just have in the back of your mind that it could happen at any time. And certainly watching Threads at school, it was shown at school, which if you watch the movie, you will be shocked by that. But
that was horrifying. I can't believe it.
Yeah, it was shown in school. We watched it in 2 parts because it's a 2-hour movie. So I guess we watched it in two different classes, 2 different days to try and lessen the impact. But yeah, it stayed with me, and apparently it stayed with a whole generation of people. And Mick Jackson has talked about that. Having the experience of lots of people coming up to him and talking to him about it. Here's a clip from his commentary where he mentions this.
I'm hearing a lot now from people who saw it as kids, either were shown it or a partial version of it in schools, or they weren't allowed to see it but peeked in through the door when their parents were watching it, and the effect it had on them traumatized them and stayed with them as they grew up. Well, good, I say.
Exactly. So, yeah, kind of the same thing. Yeah.
So he's quite happy that he's scarred an entire generation of school children because he wanted people to think about it, to campaign against it, to try and move for change. And in both cases, it does seem to have moved the needle. I think Reagan saw The Day After, and it had an impact. And apparently he saw Threads as well, and it had an impact too.
Yeah, I read that from several different sources, and Nicholas Meyer mentions it as well, that Reagan saw The Day After and was very upset by it. And so we'll be talking about some of the numbers here in Spreadsheet Corner in a minute. But first, I loved the observation that you made about there are several movies, which we'll be sort of quickly going through in a minute, but there's some symbolism that was very on the nose, but like I don't know if I completely put it together until you pointed it out.
Yes, so the fall of the British Empire, if anybody's wondering, the symbol for that, apparently, you will not be shocked to hear, is tea. So in the war game, which I mentioned in 1966, the destruction of the domestic peace is depicted by a teacup being blown off a shelf and smashing. In another film that we'll talk about a little bit later, When the Wind Blows, an animated movie, a whole teapot is smashed against a wedding photograph to symbolize the end of civilization. And a slight riff on this, but in both When the Wind Blows and in Threads, we get to see milk bottles which is a very uniquely British thing. I think milk being delivered to your doorstep, essential part of tea making, of course. You see them being melted by the heat wave from a nuclear blast. So that's how we symbolize the destruction of British civilization. There's no more tea, people. Because that's
Well,
the end.
and so of course when you said that, I was like, okay, well, so what are they going to do in the day after? So I'm watching the day after and I'm trying to think, like, what would you use if you were trying to have a symbol of America and like the destruction of it? And I was kind of like not getting it. The only one that I came up with was in the day after, they show this white horse in the beginning, and then this of course turns into a skeleton on the right because that's how they do it in that movie. But the horse, you can see there's no fence around this horse, even though there probably is a fence there, but it symbolizes freedom, I assume, the white horse.
Oh, I
And
see. Yeah, of course.
American freedom, because that's what everything's all about over here. But yeah, they don't really show the horse's body later, but they do show him turning into a horsey skeleton.
No.
So it was kind of fakey. So in that sense, it wasn't as upsetting to watch, I will say.
Whereas the tea being destroyed was
The tea
just,
was very upsetting. I mean, I've had nightmares
just
about
yeah.
that. But what are you going to do? There were a number of other movies that in the 80s, it's not surprising, that came out that were about nuclear destruction. I'm not going to necessarily name all of these, but there's the one called One Night Stand from 1984. That's Australian. You've got Threads from the BBC. These are all TV movies. There was a short that was an animated short that I'll talk about in a moment. That's called The Big Snit, which is it's like, I don't know, 8 to 10 minutes long. But of course we have like bigger movies that everyone's heard of. Like, of course, all the Mad Max stuff. You've got The Road Warrior in 82. You've got War Games with Matthew Broderick in 1983, clearly taking the title from The War Game from the 60s. You've got The Dead Zone, where Christopher Walken, you guys talked about this in one of your movie oubliette episodes, but yeah.
Yes.
He sort of like can see the future, and he knows that this guy's going to become president, and then push the button.
Martin Sheen,
Yeah.
who was a much more sensible president later in his career.
Sure, yeah.
There we go.
Then you've got The Terminator in 84, like Superman 4, a wonderful film.
Oh, yes. Soon to come out in 4K, so I know the effects are going to be even better.
They can't get a lot worse. And one of my favorites, Hell Comes to Frogtown in 1988. So there are all kinds of tones of film that come out that have to do with nuclear war and nuclear like hellscapes after the war and stuff like that. It was definitely just on everyone's mind, though. So I thought we might run through just a few of them. I wanted to point out Wrath of Khan, which was in 82, the year before Nicholas Meyer did The Day After. I don't know that this was intentional on his part, per se, but there is a ton of nuclear symbolism in that film, from the destruction of the Genesis planet through, of course, Spock having radiation exposure and, Kirk being unable to help him. Like, he's already dead, because McCoy has that whole thing. There's a great conversation in this movie Michael was sort of reminding me about earlier today, where they're talking about the Genesis project, and McCoy and Spock are having this big conversation about, creating life, and then like, well, what would happen if you deployed this on a planet that already had life? And so there's a lot there that clearly Nicholas Meyer was working with this a lot for a while. And then the next movie was one that you watched, Conrad.
Testament. Which, did you heard of this one?
I only heard about it in researching this movie. I'd never actually, I've never seen it.
No, see, I've only come across it before as a score by James Horner, very early in James Horner's career. So I knew about it from that, and I do have the album. It's a distinctly female view on the story, a female perspective. Mm-hmm. It's directed by Lynn Littman, who is mostly a documentary filmmaker prior to this. and based on a short story by a woman named Carol Amon called The Last Testament. And it takes a much more low-key approach to the material. There's no destruction. There's just a light in the window of this small town. They see the alerts, the news alerts, but you never see the devastation or anything like that. You just watch this small town, knowing that all the big cities around them are gone, knowing that the fallout is coming, and just this town just slowly gets smaller and smaller and smaller as more people disappear and fall prey to the radiation sickness. And it's notable for having for being an early entry in a number of people's careers. So you saw on that image there, you had Kevin Costner and Rebecca De Mornay in one of their first films, and Lucas Haas. It was his first film at the age of 6. He went on to do Witness the year after. It's a really, really good drama that just focuses on a small family slowly dwindling to nothing. And it's a thinker. Yeah.
Wow. Again, super happy topic.
Yes.
But I assume probably does not have a woman having to be pulled down into a cellar or going hysterical and running out into a field of radiation.
No, and in terms of looting, I think a boy breaks in and steals some food at one point, but that's about it. Yeah, it's all people being very civil and kind and empathetic towards each other.
Well, it's Canadian.
Slowly withering away, bless them.
Of course, we had, Terminator and Terminator 2, which came out in 91. So we're trying to focus mostly on the 80s in this podcast, but obviously in 84 they didn't have the budget to really show the actual war, so it's just alluded to in some like on-screen text and some stuff that Kyle Reese says to Sarah as they're sort of fleeing, and he's describing what happens. But of course there's the famous scene in Judgment Day, Terminator 2, where in her dream Sarah Connor is sort of standing behind this chain link fence watching children at a playground, and her the Linda why is her name going out of my mind? The actress,
Sarah Connor.
Sarah Connor's, like, the actress's sister, who is her twin, is actually there on the playground with some children, and of course the bomb hits and she's watching it, and it's very impactful and horrific. So this stuff continued even into the early 90s, even after the Berlin Wall fell and perestroika and all that stuff was in place. There was the animated short that I talked about earlier called The Big Snit. It's kind of cute. Weirdly to say, but you could see it's got a very distinctive animation style, but it won some awards. It's basically just about this couple that are sort of in their house together. They're playing Scrabble. They're oblivious to the fact that this is all happening outside their window. Their cat pulls the TV cord out of the wall, so the TV kind of goes off, and they don't know why, and so they don't get any of the alerts, and they're just sort of there hanging out, oblivious to the fact that the world is ending.
Oh.
But it's a short. It's literally 8 to 10 minutes long, and it's just sort of got some commentary in there. And of course, one of the other biggest things, and this was the one I started with, was a movie called, and I think this movie actually is how we chose this episode, right? And it's called When the Wind Blows.
Yeah, which is a British animated film directed by Jimmy T. Murakami, who is probably best known for Battle Beyond the Stars, the Corman sci-fi Star Wars Xerox attempt to cash in. But this is a peculiar piece. It's based on a book by Raymond Briggs, who's probably most famous, certainly in the UK, for The Snowman, which is a perennial Christmas classic.
Yes.
And was animated. That's a short. This is a feature-length film about an elderly couple, very much the greatest generation, survived World War II, living in a very rural location, hearing about this coming war, and the two of them thinking that they can get through it with a stiff upper lip and and a makeshift shelter in their living room, and the wife is constantly worried about the curtains. She has to be forced into the shelter when the time comes, when the alert goes out. In fact, the main character calls her a stupid bitch, her husband,
Which was
and drags
shocking
her in
because
there.
there was no profanity in this up until that point. So I was not expecting that at all when that
No,
happened.
it is a bit of a slap in the face. But yeah, so you see it and you think, okay, this is another animated movie from the guy who brought us the Snowman. Oh
Hmm.
no.
No.
It's no, do
And
not show this to your
it
kids.
starts very weirdly because it has like real life like footage,
Yeah.
and then they sort of segue into the animation, and they clearly are doing some like rotoscoping of like real rooms. Um so the
Yeah, it's a
animation
very
style is
interesting
unique looking.
technique.
Yeah, it's really cool looking.
Yeah, it's all
Interesting.
real sets, animated characters on rotoscoped miniature sets.
Yeah,
So I mean, it's amazing. It's an amazing piece of work,
it is.
but again, very much like Testament, it's two characters that really don't know an awful lot in the middle of nowhere, just
Hmm.
slowly falling prey to the fallout.
Yeah. Yeah, Michael
And
was pretty horrified by that one too. He's like, "Good God, you're gonna have to take like several weeks to just cleanse your brain after this." So
yeah, it's very, very sad.
it
Very
is very
sad.
sad, very sad. Not a happy ending kind of a movie, but if you are interested in learning about what people were doing film wise, it's a must see. Like it's really one of the best ones of all these movies, in my opinion.
It is, yeah, definitely worth a look.
Hmm. So our spreadsheet corner is going to be the last thing we talk about before we sort of delve into, um, you know, the very end of this episode. So I know you did some really great research about actual facts, like actual numbers and things like that.
I did, yes. I looked at nuclear warhead stockpiles, which, that's a nice topic to look up on a Sunday afternoon. But yeah.
Hmm.
So, not surprisingly, the peak of the tensions, the period that we're looking at, just it happens to be the peak of how many warheads we had. My goodness, we had quite a lot back then. So, over 60,000 between the USSR and the United States, with a tiny slither in the middle that might be us in the UK and a few other countries. But thankfully, we've got it down to a sensible 5 or 6 thousand warheads each now.
Still plenty.
So
It's still
it's
plenty.
still plenty to kill everybody on the planet five
Mhm.
times over, but at least it's not enough to kill us 50 times over, which is where we were
Right.
in the early 80s. Not surprisingly, this had an impact on the number of feature films and TV movies featuring nuclear war. Over the same period, there's a massive peak in the early 80s, the period that we're talking about here. And
Mhm.
if you put the two together, there's quite an obvious correlation.
There's sort of a little bit of a trend there.
There really is, and I think they're probably symptoms of the same, exactly the same tension, rather than directly related to each other. The interesting thing here is look at the number of films featuring this topic now in recent years.
I think it's probably because the nuclear thing is so analogous to like the pandemic and so many other issues that we're dealing with right now, in addition to the fact that there's also some nuclear stuff going on right now as well. So it's like everyone was worried that the 20s, the 2020s were going to be like the 1920s and with the depression, and I mean that remains to be seen, but it sort of feels a lot more like the 80s, like in some ways, like the late 70s, early 80s kind of feel. I don't know if you agree with that, but
Yeah, I do. I think that there was on the commentary tracks, everybody's making the analogy about Korea, which just
mm,
points out the period when they were recorded. Now I think everybody is looking at Russia a little
yeah.
bit nervously these
Yeah.
days. So that tension is coming back up again.
Yeah, I mean, and so all of that to say, like some of the I've seen these memes, but it's like, Gen X usually gets overlooked when it comes to like talking about millennials and Gen Z and versus the boomers and all these different things. But I know the boomers actually also grew up with the nuclear nightmare as well, like because it really overlapped their whole childhoods because they came after obviously World War II. But it was very heightened after the Cuban Missile Crisis, like I said. And so our generation, it really defined who we were in a big way, I think. And certainly if you were a kid in the 80s at all. So, we have some like coping strategies, even if they're not good ones, Gen Z. Like if you need some help, like find one of us and we'll walk you through it. Like we'll give you some like weird movies to watch,
Yeah.
you know.
And you'll enjoy them and be slightly traumatized.
That's right. All right. So that wraps up the bulk of our research. So now we're going to have the fun time of going through some super chats and some
Ah, do
chats
we
that
have
have been
some?
starred for us. So going way back probably to the beginning of the show, Conrad, do you still have that Scout Walker? Michael wants to
Of,
know.
of course I do. And it still has all of its guns and none of them are broken. So there you go.
Very nice. Jason wants to know, or he says, we've seen Conrad's Riff Tracks humor. We know the darkness of his soul.
Yes. Yes.
He also says, I remember my public school doing duck and cover drills in the hallways, and the older kids basically saying, tuck in and kiss your ass goodbye, which is funny because I actually went through the lyrics of some Megadeth songs, in particular, like the second track on So Far, So Good, So What. And he says, time to kiss your ass goodbye. The end has just begun. And the kids back in the day, like in the 50s, 60s, when they showed those duck and cover films, really did used to say, bend over and kiss your ass goodbye. And I really think that's where that lyric comes from as well.
Yeah. Wouldn't surprise me. Did
Yep.
the duck and cover thing, did you actually believe it would work?
I was never taught the duck and cover, but I don't think anybody thought they stopped doing it because obviously they were like, well, it's not really going to help. The kids also, if second graders are going, this isn't really going to help because we've literally seen, like I had seen by third grade, like footage of World War II and like what happened in Japan and the aftermath. And it's like getting under a desk is not going to help you. Like,
Yeah, I think we all knew, and yet the government in the UK was still prepared to send out like these information leaflets called "Protect and Survive,"
mm,
which is lampooned quite effectively in When the Wind Blows because the
yeah,
guy in that is just following it to the letter and creating his inner core and refuge,
he is.
and making sure they've got all the things that they're supposed to have, and it's just a nonsense. It's a complete nonsense.
Learning about the British affinity for getting a door and leaning it at a 30-degree angle in your living room and putting a mattress and like all these things was like I've never heard that. That's so interesting that was like a clearly it was a thing.
It was a thing, yeah. That was the advice in the Protect and Survive pamphlet and the information film, which is a special feature on the When the Wind Blows disc.
Yeah.
And it's mortifying when you watch it because it's like, no, this is not going to help.
Yeah. Wicked Person says, raised to believe the rapture was happening this week, so it seemed naive to me as a child to think nuclear disaster or global warming and so on would ever have time to happen. That's a really good point. Yeah. And that was like very pervasive as well during the 80s. So,
Yeah, of course.
Yesterland Toy says, my parents said in the 50s they would have nuclear drills in school and get under their desks. So, yeah, that's what we were talking about a second ago. Jesse says, question, are they bringing this up because of what's happening in Eastern Europe? Not necessarily. Like, if you're talking about why we're talking about it, no, I think I actually came across the movie When the Wind Blows and I was like intrigued. I had never seen it and I thought it's animated. So does that mean it's for kids? Came out in 86. I was like, I have to know more. And I put it on our list. Conrad and I have a Trello list where we put all of our ideas. And we were combing through and Conrad goes, oh, you've got to see that. Because he's
Yeah.
warped.
Yeah. But then we got to talking about, landmarks in this genre. And I think Threads and The Day After are probably the landmarks in this genre.
Yeah. Yeah. Jason says in response to my comment, he says, actually, don't do that. Do not look up nuclear close calls for your own mental health. That's probably true.
Yeah.
Chasing 80s Toy says, compliments for the interesting topic. Happy to listen to a Dreamland podcast live. We're happy to have you here. Gloop Trekker says, I remember an episode of Silver Spoons where Ricky dreamed he was president. The Russians sank the Love Boat. Ricky called up Andropov and told him to walk off the edge of a cliff and drop off. Okay. Yeah, so Jason says, day after was the first big event TV show. I remember that literally everyone watched. Yeah, I remember it was a big thing. I just was way too young to be allowed to watch that. Keith says, Threads, most disturbing nuclear war film ever.
Yeah, I'm with you, Keith.
I would agree. Kenny says, Threads in the day after scarred me. Only seen them once and never ever again. Why? Why would you not want to watch that over and over?
With commentary, yeah. for a month.
That's right. He says, my personal fan theory is War Games and Terminator are in the same universe.
Whopper.
Whopper was the first attempt at Sky. Oh, that's right. Whopper, yeah.
Whopper, yeah.
Mm-hmm. George Aitken says it was a really sad one where the old couple don't understand why they are dying, and it gets sadder.
Yeah, it does.
It does.
You kind of, I don't know. You can sort of get irritated with them though, because they are kind of dumb.
I know. The people in the animated When the Wind Blows, like they're both fairly unlikable. I don't think they were intended to be, but Texas Beast says nukes ionize gases in the air. Nitrogen briefly glows blue. Hydrogen, oxygen, and water vapor glow purple. Well, science time. Thanks for that information. At least it'll look pretty, right?
Yeah. We can look forward to the light show.
Master Son says, yay, spreadsheets. Now it's a party. Texas Beast also says radiation goes through soft tissue easier than bones or clothes. It's actually a good if simple representation of reality. Nice.
Scary.
Let's see. Sean says, I watched The Day After for the first time since I was a kid a few years ago, and I was depressed for like a week afterward. I guess that was the intended effect. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do.
Yeah, like Mick Jackson said that, kids went up to him and said, you scarred me as a kid in the 80s. And he said, good.
Yeah,
that's what I wanted.
Chazilla, thank you so much for the super chat. He says, great episode, heavy but timely. Just don't hear much on this topic anymore, but it was very common in the 80s. Our school had an assembly on The Day After. Lots of scared kids. On a lighter note, loved the childhood pics. Yeah.
So we looked cute, even if we were terrified.
We didn't even let on. Jason Anderson says, Hell Comes to Frogtown is one of those films you think is a joke until you realize it isn't.
It should be in the oubliette, surely.
Let's see. We've got Master Son. Thank you so much. He says, in the 80s, they should have had a summary of survivability on the back of these movies. The boy and the mean lady survive. At least I would know what to avoid. If the dog dies, I'm not watching. Well, then I would say don't watch any of these movies because the dog dies in all the movies.
Yeah, pretty much.
But to be fair, most of the people do too.
Yeah.
I mean,
at least in When the Wind Blows, you only hear the dog. You don't
that's
see
true.
the dog.
You only hear him, and they're like, "Oh, he must be hungry." I'm like, I don't think that's it. Scuba Pete says, current situation is freaking my kid out now. Trying to comfort her, but yeah, it totally feels like the 80s again. Yeah, I can see that would be true. And Master Son says, I remember being freaked out by nuclear war and Nostradamus. I was like, who is this guy and why is all this stuff coming true? But in reality, it was hokum. And then let's see. Are We the Baddies says, in the UK, we were taught to lean doors to build shelters. What were the US taught to do to survive? Well, we didn't really talk about it in my memory in the 80s, but I think probably more go into a bomb shelter. A lot of people did have bomb shelters, that's even referenced in like a cheesy movie like Terror Vision, where the grandpa has a bomb shelter that's sort of like the basement of the house, but it's sort of akin to, if you've ever seen The Wizard of Oz, you know, they have the storm shelter that's like you go outside and then you climb in. And so a lot of people in America had those at a certain time. But,
Mm.
you know, I don't know. It would really depend how much that would help you. Um, Wildstar says, I don't think there were any public schools in the US still trying to convince anyone that duck and cover was going to help by the time Gen X was in school. And I would agree with that. Um, and then Analog Toy says, the way Melinda's holding that microphone, I keep expecting her to break into song. Yeah, that was terrible. But there you go. Yeah, so um, this was it was really interesting, and since we don't have any slides about this, but I wanted to point out something that Conrad had sort of shown me, which kind of did make me feel a little bit better. You found this really interesting um, information about what would really happen if, you know, we were bombed, and like that it may not be as bad as we were initially taught. Like the whole nuclear winter thing may not actually be, even though I know Carl Sagan was like super into promoting that and probably definitely really believed all of that. It seems like maybe that's not thought to be as accurate anymore.
No, it's there's a really interesting video essay, and we'll include a link to it in our show notes, that works through the current thinking on this, which is that although it will, the idea for the nuclear winter was that all of these explosions and the resulting fires would throw so much soot and material into the atmosphere that it would block out the sun and it would destroy agriculture and it would mean the end of all life on Earth, certainly in the northern hemisphere. It seems as though that was all based on really early computer modeling, and as things have gotten a little bit more sophisticated as time has gone on, it looks as though most of that would clear within a few days. If you look at things like the fires in Australia, for example, it only reduced the temperature by about 1 degree for a very short period of time. So the thinking now is it's possibly not as, I mean, it's still, let's be clear, not great.
No, not great.
But
lots of people will die.
Yeah, possibly not as you know.
It may look different.
It's not like an extinction level event, because a lot of people compared it to the meteorite that wiped out the dinosaurs, but apparently the energy that released dwarfs every nuclear stockpile we've ever had. So
that was like a really massive thing. But I mean, not to downplay, but just to say it is. I don't know why it's comforting. I don't even know if it really is comforting, but the guy who does it is very, like, he puts my spreadsheets to shame. Like, he's very good at data and telling the story with data. And so if you're interested in that, again, we'll post that link in our show notes. So I would recommend checking out his work. He's done a ton of research and worked with a lot of Nobel Peace Prize folks to compile all of that information. Yeah. And so that pretty much wraps up this episode. I do want to let you know that we will be doing a Patreon after show. So
yes, which I may not survive.
So because this topic was so heavy, we decided that we would have a very fun after show today to try to perk everyone back up again. So about a month ago, maybe not quite a month ago, I sent Conrad a USA care package with all kinds of things you can't, like foods that you cannot buy in the UK, so that Conrad could taste them. And so Conrad is going to sample some of those things on the after show, and you guys can watch and get his reaction to things like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, Little Debbie snacks, Fritos, things that you take for granted that Conrad has never had and is really excited, probably not, but really excited to eat. So just saying, like, he's going to mute his microphone while he's chewing, so don't worry.
Yeah.
But then he will, like, you will see his face So it'll either be like yummy face or gross face. And then he will tell us his opinion and rate on a scale of like 1 to 10, like how good or bad it is. So check that out if you're interested. For just $1, you can be on our Patreon and see that right after this show. So we will be back in February with our next, or nope, not February, March. We will be back in March with our next Dreamland. Which, Conrad, what is our title, our hint title for next time?
So our hint title for the next episode is Yarns.
Yarns for Americans. Yarns.
Yarns.
Yarns. So we'll be asking you in the upcoming weeks what you think that's going to be about. So until then, you can follow me and Conrad on Retroblasting and Movie Oubliette respectively on all social media outlets. And you can email us at the Dreamland Podcast, not just Dreamland Podcast, but the Dreamland Podcast at gmail.com. Thanks everyone for listening. Goodbye.